Vandana Shiva is ecologist. She writes many books and she's an activist for women struggle in India, and she is managing or directing the Research Foundation for Science, Technology, Natural Resources Policy. And I give you the word as...
Thank you so much.
Thanks very much.
And apologies for being late. I'm not responsible. The traffic of Paris is. And the strikes, which workers have to engage in to ensure their space in society. I was very happy to receive the invitation about the future of work within the ecological transition, because we've had 200 years of a transition which has simultaneously destroyed the planet and destroyed people's economy, including their possibility to work. Both economy and ecology are derived from the same word, oikos. And that's why Laudato Si is such a significant text, because it reminded us that this is our common home. And managing the common home was supposed to be the work of economy. Understanding the rules of our home was ecology. But the two separated, and that separation hasn't had one step, it has had many steps, and those steps are still continuing. In my view, the first step was colonialism, which in effect took away the resources that supported people and made them for the first time landless, resourceless, and very often foodless. The famines of India are such a clear example. 20 years within the entry of the rule of the East India Company, 10 million people had died of famine. It took just 20 years for the most prosperous, most fertile soils of Bengal to no more feed their people, because now it was all being extracted as rents and revenues. The second very big break is the beginning of the fossil fuel age, which is also the beginning of the devastation of the planet and the problems that are now being recognized as a planetary emergency, the ecological emergency, the climate catastrophe. They're all related to just 200 years of our existence on this earth. In the pre-industrial era, we did not build up greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Fossil fuels are nothing but 600 million years of nature's work in burying carbon underground and fossilizing it and turning it into gas and oil. And we thought that by tapping this without limits and burning 20 million years worth every year, we could cheat nature. We could break the planetary boundaries. We would have perpetual growth. The climate crisis is showing us that's not possible. But it is what it did to work that is more significant and has not yet been fully taken into account. Because for the first time, we evolved an economy in which getting rid of people was the measure of efficiency and productivity. So productivity in any economic system is measured as output per unit input. how much do you produce, and how much do you put in. Now, in an honest economic assessment, everything that you produce should be part of the output. And everything that goes in should be part of the input. But I realized that the only input being counted was labor. And this too is an amazing new separation. First, we were divided in our minds from the earth that supports us. That's what the encyclical is about. That's what Laudato Si is about. Then we were separated from community, from being members of the community. Then we were separated within ourselves by all kinds of mechanistic constructions that divided the body and the mind when they are indivisible. That divided our capacity to work from our being. And the capacity to work was reduced to labor as a commodity to be sold. And if you start looking at the definitions, till that time of the industrial age and the fossil fuel age, work was defined as cultivation, as creativity, as ability to produce. After fossil fuel age, work is redefined as labor and as drudgery that has to be gotten rid of. But of course, if you're selling your capacity to work to someone else and you're being made to work in highly exploitative conditions, that work does become drudgery. But if I'm a peasant working on my own land, when I talk to tribal peasants in India, they don't say I'm going to produce food. They don't use the word production. They say, I'm going to beautify the earth. Because cultivation of the earth is caring for the earth. And work which was a relationship with the earth was now separated from the earth, but separated from the person working. And then along the way came yet another definition. The definition of growth. The measure of growth, let me take a step back. So growth used to mean living systems evolving. Yeah? A seed grows into a plant, an acorn grows into an oak tree, a fetus grows into a human being. Each of you were once little fetuses in your mother's wombs. And today you are what you are. You have grown. Growth in living systems is a self-organized evolutionary system. This was taken into economics. And now, growth was defined in a very strange way. And I woke up to this when I was doing research to understand why women's work didn't count. Most of the work in the world is done by women. And yet, all census data has, I don't work, women don't work. They work the hardest, and yet they don't work. And this contradiction is rooted in the fact that during the war, there was need to mobilize resources to finance the war. How do you mobilize resources to finance the war? You take what's circulating in society and direct it to buying jet planes, financing bigger armies, and financing the war. And the definition of growth that is on the basis of GDP, gross domestic product, GNP, gross national product, and growth is the most powerful number in the world. Any government can do any violence to the earth and any violence to society in the name of growth. The definition of growth in the UN system of accounting is, if you produce what you consume, you don't produce. So nature produces water and then consumes the water. She doesn't produce water. Women produce food and their families and their communities consume it. Peasants of the world are producers, but they produce first and foremost for their communities. And of course some extra goes. I just walked through the Africa conference or something that's going on, and I could just see there was ivory cocoa. Of course they'll sell cocoa, but they won't sell off everything and then starve themselves. So in circular economies, nature returns part of her own production to herself to renew the water cycle, the nutrient cycle, and all the systems. Societies and communities give back to themselves, so no one starves. You know, just coming through Paris over the years, it is so stark, whether it's Paris or it's London or New York, these big cities of the powerful world, they have so many throwaway people now. So many throwaway people. Because we stopped circulating wealth to be shared by all. And this extractive system that was created, and the definition of growth, which says if you produce what you consume, you're not producing, means you're only counted as producing if you sell a commodity and you buy what you need. Which leads to yet another separation between production and consumption. And I'll come to this later, the consequences of this for work. So the rupture of our work with nature and that being counted as not work, or the opportunities to do that work being destroyed because peasants are displaced, land is degraded. I see the refugee crisis really as a crisis of the destruction of the homeland of people. No one leaves home if everything is fine. There are two reasons why people leave their countries as refugees. And the United Nations Biodiversity Convention has put out two recent reports, one last year. Its policy body called the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Functions said that if we do not stop degrading land, the world will be a land of refugees, of uprooted people. An incapacity to do work with nature to maintain your life because the land has been so degraded. And of course it's very easy to say it's local people who do it, but I have worked on ecological issues for 50 years. 50 years. No local community will destroy its own support base. They're displaced by a dam. They're displaced by industrial agriculture. There's so much reference to the violence around Lake Chad. 4 years ago, we did a manifesto linking the refugee crisis and the soil crisis. It's called Terra Viva, and it's available on the website of Navdanya International. It's both available in Italian as well as English. And the refugees were coming, and the boats were sinking. And of course, now you have European elections, and there are entire parties that are saying no one should be allowed to come to the shores. Because at that time, most of the boats were coming to the Italian island of Lampedusa, where Pope Francis went personally. We thought we'd look at where are the boats coming. Now, Africa is one very big place. for the refugee crisis, and Syria has got added recently. Lake Chad, we analyzed. Why is there conflict around Lake Chad? Because this lake, which was one of the largest lakes of Africa, 22,000 square kilometers, its water was not allowed to be renewed because commercial agriculture surrounded the lake, and all the rivers that fed into the lake were being diverted for commercial agriculture, production of commodities. Very water intensive, very chemical. Chemical farming uses 10 times more water to produce the same amount of produce. And over time, the lake started to dry when 80% of your water isn't coming to renew your water. That cycle is broken. The lake dries up. And it creates a competition for resources and conflicts over resources. There were 3 communities that depended on the lake: the fishermen, the pastoralists, and the farmers. And what I very often called religious conflicts were really conflicts of these different communities. Because in every one of our societies over time, historically, different groups have adopted different religions. In Africa, by and large, pastoralists, some Muslims, settled farmers have more often than not become Christians. So what are actually conflicts over resources and the destruction of the possibility to work as a fisherman, as a farmer, as a livestock herder, then creates a whole new separation within society. And it creates the uprooting. If you go to Latin America, where dear President Trump is trying to build a wall, most of the refugees there are coming from the Central American countries. These are countries that have been destroyed by American free trade and American destabilization of the societies through military intervention. Now, over time, when you destroy societies, people's ability to work in their societies is threatened. If your soil is gone, you can't work as a peasant. But if your local economy is destroyed, and now because more and more people are unemployed, criminal economies take over in place of the economy of productive, creative work. And I have witnessed this when I was in Mexico for a public hearing. You know, Mexico in 1994, its peasant agriculture was destroyed by NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. 20 years later, 1/3 of Mexico's economy is crime economy. 1/3. And because of these criminal gangs, life for ordinary hardworking citizens becomes impossible. And so if you hear the narratives of the refugees going to America, they're all saying, the gangs shot my husband and they were extorting money from me. I had to run away to save my children. Why do we have gangs suddenly in these 20, 30 years of neoliberal globalization? Because work that sustained people has been destroyed. And with it, honest living has been destroyed. It takes very little. I remember, it was the early days of globalization, and I was giving a talk with Gorbachev. He had just opened up the Soviet Union, and it hadn't collapsed as a Soviet Union. And he said something that has stayed in my heart. He said, when I made the policy of perestroika, I thought we would get free market democracy. Instead, we got the mafia. Just look at how Russia is run? Who are the oligarchs? And that's happening to all our societies. Let me come back to how elevating a construct, the construct that makes a promise of exchange, become the creative force of the economy. I'm trying to dig into my wallet to your notes don't say it, but our Indian currency says, I promise to pay the bearer. Here. Now this is also not, it just says this is a legal tender. It actually says in God we trust, the American dollar. It says they trust in God. But money as a means of exchange has been used forever. I mean, they're digging up coins from ancient kingdoms all over the world, and archaeological sites of 6,000 BC, 8,000 BC. Coins and money exchange is not new. But taking this means of exchange between people, turning it into a construct, and giving it creative power is what capitalism has done. It has taken capital, which is merely that piece of paper, redefined in an abstract way, capital, which used to, in Italian origins in Latin, used to mean caput, the head of you, number of heads of animals. But money, from being a means of exchange, was elevated to being a force of creation. If you look at where John Locke talks about creation of property, it's interesting. He says, every time you mix your labor with nature, you are creating property. But it is not the labor of the horse or the serf. You didn't add women. But it is the labor of the one who owns the horse and the serf. And he goes on to say the spiritual labor. Because the person who's not doing work is not laboring. Yeah? So capital is not just given creative power, it's given spiritual power. I spent my last 30 years working in a field to prevent the patenting of life and the patenting of seed, which is what Monsanto wanted to do. And I said, but you don't create the seed. And an invention means you have to create something new. Seed is not your invention, it's creation. And a patent on seed is so ontologically wrong that I will save seeds, and that's what I do, and that's why I created the movement Navdanya. And you're very welcome to go to the website of navdanya.org, which is our work in India, the work with our farmers, the work with women. We offered a whole month course on how to work non-violently with the earth to produce more food. And it's possible. We've done it for 30 years. If the whole world produced food by taking care of creation, we would feed 2 times the world population. And we'd protect the bees. Today is World Bee Day. Happy World Bee Day. We would protect the water. We would regenerate the soil. Most importantly, we would reverse climate change. Because climate change is a result of shifting our economies from the cycles of nature and our partnership with nature into economies based on fossil fuels and products derived from fossil fuels, and calling that efficiency by measuring the lower numbers of people engaged as efficiency. So I began with saying, in any economic system, economic efficiency is output per unit input. Now, if you measured fossil fuels, industrial farming systems are a negative economy. They wouldn't exist because they use 10 units of energy as input to produce 1 unit of food in kilocalories. No system where the input is 10 times more than what you produce can exist. How does it exist? It gets all the subsidies. In Europe, half the money of the taxpayer goes to fund industrial farming through CAP, the Common Agriculture Policy. Now, if this, can you imagine what you could do with half the tax money of this country, of Europe? There'd be no homeless person, there'd be no hungry child, there'd be nobody who couldn't go to school and college. Everything could be taken care of, half of the budget. $400 billion is the global subsidy for industrial farming. That's more than $1 billion a day. That's how an inefficient system is kept afloat, but it's also kept afloat because scientifically there's a distortion. You don't count that input. And I realized this when I was doing a study of the Punjab, where I'd done my MSc honors in physics. And then in the 80s, it was exploding in violence. The military was sent. I wrote a book called The Violence of the Green Revolution and realized that every definition was a manipulated definition. Punjab was not growing more food. But when you measure that measure of productivity, where input is how much work goes into farming, of course the more tractors you have, the more efficient it is. The more poisons you spray, the more urea you throw, is going to be measured as more productive. But the women were driven out of work. They had no role in this toxic agriculture. And for the first time during my study of Punjab, I saw billboards advertising female feticide. Select the fetus of your child. Why do you need girls? According to the economist Amartya Sen, in India alone, because of the displacement of women in productive work, they have been turned into the dispensable sex. Amartya Sen's calculations are 35 million girls haven't been born. Because you first make them dispensable, there's no place for their work economically, and then you say they don't have a right to exist. Young people, when you produce as community, the whole family would produce. The father would go, the son would go, the daughter would go, the wife would go. Everyone would go to the field. With a tractor and a spray of poison, a 60-year-old father can do the farming. For the first time, the next generation is useless. No work. You know what's happening to the next generation? 75% of the youth of Punjab are drug addicts. 75%. So you're creating wasted generations. If they're not drug addicts, they're depressed. Are the farmers themselves doing well? No, there's so much poison that there's a cancer train that leaves Punjab for Rajasthan, where there's a charitable cancer hospital. And that's not all. A system that gets rid of people and replaces people with fossil fuels, chemicals, and machines requires more capital. That capital means more debt. In my country, those deaths mean more suicides. 300,000 farmers have committed suicide since globalization and neoliberal policies were introduced. But across the world, there are suicides of farmers in France. There are suicides of farmers in England. There are suicides of farmers in Australia. There are suicides of farmers in the United States. It's an untold story. I've tried to tell it for my country, and I can tell you, I've had the typical mafia attacks from Monsanto, because the worst suicides are in the cotton belt, which they totally monopolize with the Bt cotton seed. We are now reaching a new threshold. And that is related to the fact that if the fossil fuel age substituted human labor with fossil fuel energy, the new age of big data as oil, they call it big data is the oil of our time, is creating a situation of 99% people useless. Artificial intelligence, robotics, we've just done a report, and I brought a copy. We've just done a report on the future of farming, and basically what is being imagined by the big corporations and what the earth needs. What do we need for the transition? The Monsanto and their fellow companies, Bayer has bought Monsanto, Dow has merged with DuPont, Syngenta has merged with ChemChina. These three corporations as a cartel control all our food and all our health, and the seed, and how we think about what food is. Monsanto's new vision is farming without farmers. Drones spraying Roundup, which is giving cancer. There are 3 big cases. The latest was a $2 billion jury order in the case of a cancer victim in America. And I heard that a Canadian farmer has also said, I've got cancer because I sprayed Roundup, which was by WHO marked as a carcinogen years ago. The farming without farmers means you don't need people at all. Who'll do the work? Driverless tractors? Artificial intelligence? Robots? Of course it doesn't work. It doesn't work. But the illusion is there. You know, today's bee day, 75% bees in places where there's intensive poison use have disappeared. Now bees are workers. Nobody works as hard as bees. And the work of nature wasn't even counted in all of these 200 years. But now ecologists are starting to count the contributions. Pollinators contribute 600 billion annually to the food economy. They work hard. So with the disappearance of bees, what are they thinking of? Oh, we'll make robotic bees. They're very clumsy. They don't have the sophistication and intelligence of a bee, you know. And in any case, there are 20,000 bee species. And just for coffee, bees undertake 22 trillion pollinator visits to flowers. 22 trillion. These poor machines will collapse. You can't keep up. The idea that you don't need farmers is related also to the fact that first Amazon entered and, Jeff Bezos became the richest man. Does he work? He doesn't do a thing. Gandhi had said, among the 7 sins is wealth without work. All of our billionaires of today do no work. And when I say work, it means expenditure of energy. That's what the physical definition is. I spend energy to do something. If I just sit and gamble financially, or I create a platform for distribution, I produce nothing, But I create a platform which destroys those who produce. That's what Amazon has done. And now they're saying we don't even need workers in our distribution centers. We're going to have robots. So you destroy the real economy and the real work, reduce it to distribution. Now you say even there I don't need people. Zuckerberg said with artificial intelligence 99% will be useless. All of them are getting used to the idea that we are throwaway people. Some of them think we are on a throwaway planet. There's the person, Elon Musk, who is supposed to be very ecological and made the electric car. The poor man's trying to escape to Mars. He's got SpaceX to escape to Mars, and he says, I'll be able to, for $1 billion ticket, I'll be able to arrange the escape of 1 million people. But we are 7 billion. Yeah, we are 7 billion, right? Yeah, we are 7 billion right now. So, subtract 1 million from 7 billion and think of the rest. They're saying let the earth go to hell. That's their assumption. Even that brilliant physicist Hawking said there are only two options: escape or extinction. I said neither. We don't have to push other species to extinction if we work in ways that takes care of creation. That's the work we do in Navdanya. I hope some of you will come. Please go to the website and see. We save seeds because I did not accept seeds to be the invention and monopoly of Monsanto. We've saved 4,000 rice varieties, 250 wheat varieties. We grow 2,000 crop varieties on our farm. We just saved seeds because we felt that was our ecological, ethical duty. We have 6 times more pollinators. When you take care of creation, creation takes care of herself. We just have to do the service. Our work is work in service of the earth and service of community and service of the vulnerable. The rest takes care of itself. So what's the role of work in the ecological transition? First, to remember the message of Laudato Si, that the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor is one cry. They're not separate. It's time to stop thinking of justice in one silo and ecological sustainability in the other. They're two facets of the same problem. The second thing we have to do is redefine work. Third thing we have to do is recognize that every being has a right to be on this planet. And we have a duty to take care of this planet so all beings can prosper and thrive. But every child has a right to a future. No person deserves to go hungry. And it's in that shifting of work we address the 3 big emergencies we are facing right now. The planetary emergency of species extinction and climate catastrophe, and soil destruction and the water crisis, the production emergency of the end of work, but with it the consumption emergency. Because in maximizing commodity production and destroying the rights of the workers, we have created a situation of degraded production, degraded services. If you hear the stories of what the fast food system is doing to our health, food is supposed to nourish us. If you look at the stories of what's happening to workers in the fast fashion chain, dying in factories in Bangladesh, our cotton farmers dying in their fields for debt, the women of China enslaved in the garment factories. This is not the work that sovereign human beings on a beautiful earth define. Work has to be reclaimed to be able to reclaim our life and freedom. And work has to be redefined from being drudgery and end of work being a liberation to work being liberating because it gives us an opportunity to co-create, serve, and regenerate the planet.
So there is only 5 minutes for one question of clarification or something like that, because otherwise we will not have time to eat and come back in terms. Yeah? Emil?
Good morning. I am Emil Secuda from Argentina. Thank you so much for your presentation. You said something about the youth, that they are involved in drugs, and they are unemployed, and they are depressive. And you speak about mafias. And my question is, because as Carl Schmitt said, the state is an exception. So the mafia, the organized crime, in my opinion, is not an exception. If not, they are taking the place of the state. And the role of the state is to care the body of the people and the food they must to eat. So, which is your opinion about the role of the state in this change? What must the state do about that? Thank you so much.
Yeah. Part of what neoliberalism has done is mutated the state, which was a public state, from being of the people, by the people, for the people, through a representative process, into of the corporations, by the corporations, for the corporations. And you just have to see two examples. One, in Austria, they're having to have new elections because the vice-chancellor, the right-wing vice-chancellor, was found to be making deals with a Russian oligarch, saying, we will sell you our newspapers, we will sell you our public institutions, but you finance me for elections. And this marriage between the billionaires, the illegitimate billionaires, and people standing for elections is part of the reason where strange people are getting elected to represent countries. I mean, it's not an isolated phenomenon, it's happening just everywhere. You look at these people and say, how did they represent an entire country? And how did people elect them? You know? But the second is right here in France. Look at the protests. The yellow vests every week. The security of work has been damaged because part of neoliberalism is austerity. Cut what people need, privatize, and hand over entire sectors as money-making sectors. I have a new book and I'm going to leave it with you. It's called Oneness versus the 1%. It'll be out in French sometime soon. But this English version is from India. It's for you. And in it, I have first of all shown how quickly the billionaires have shrunk. 177 in 211, 62 in 2016, 8 in 2017, 5 last year. They have politicians in their pocket. Literally in their pockets. So what is the future of the state and what's the future of electoral democracy? A, we must rebuild economies from the base up. That is the future of work, that's the future of ecological regeneration, but it's also the future of regenerating democracy. Democracy never grows from the top down, it always grows from the bottom up. The second thing we must do is reclaim the state as a public state. And in countries where it can happen fast, we do it fast, but we must persevere over time. Just because one bad leader selling off the economy means we don't give up on reclaiming our democracy. And the third thing we do is bring what was always part of the separation of money and political power. It was a necessary separation. Mussolini said fascism is the merger of economic and political power. The fact that fascism is growing is because those two powers have merged. We have to separate them. And the only way to separate them is to allow the ecological discourse, the ethical discourse, the justice discourse to become so much more prevalent. Just think of the fact that it took a small movement called Extinction Rebellion to get the British Parliament to recognize there's an emergency. And it took one little girl to start school strikes for people to realize there's a problem. We have to build the movements. And we have to be grateful to Pope Francis for being persistent in inspiring change.
Thanks very much. So we need to leave if we want. Sorry, for the next time I will not be able. Thanks very much. So, this is